Welcome to Finlos Asks. I'm happy to introduce you to Alice. She is one of my oldest friends. We went to high school together, have been roommates, and even now keep in touch regularly despite the fact that she lives in England. She is one of the first people I knew who challenged my assumptions about politics and personal identity. She studied sociology at Smith College and went on to earn her PhD from UC Irvine. In this conversation, we discuss what it was like to grow up in a multicultural city with parents from different countries, how an international perspective might enrich domestic conversations, and how, like identity, feeling at home can be a fluid concept. How long have you been living in England now?
It's been 6.5 years. Time's flying, man.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. And as you get to travel back and forth, like what are some of the particular um, differences in both living there, but also how? I mean, just speak to the differences of those experiences.
It's funny, right? Because I think um, in some ways, the longer I'm in the UK, the more normalized things get, right? And the more
Mm-hmm.
sort of that becomes my baseline. And then when I come back, I sort of it's a weird combination of things feeling very familiar, but then also things feeling like, oh wait, things are not operating the same way that I was expecting. Um, but yeah, I lived a very different life in the U.S. versus in the U.K. Because I don't have a car in the U.K. and so I use public transit to get everywhere, which is mostly fine because I live in sort of a more suburban area and that kind of things. Whereas here, I have access to a car and sort of driving around. But I think in a weird way, I think a lot of the when I think about what I miss from the States when I'm in the UK, a lot of it has to do with foodstuffs, like comfort foods and stuff like that.
Right.
And sort of things that I miss, that happen that are done that way. But I also, Americans are very friendly, and that's really nice. And the Brits can be very friendly too, but not not necessarily always. But yeah, I think one of the things I have noticed though in the UK is that because I am an American in the UK and because I am sort of like a foreigner, I feel like I have permission to do things that other people don't because I can lean in. I'm like, oh, they'll just be like, oh, it's an American. That's why. That's why they did that. So I act in ways that I think that I wouldn't be bold enough to act in the US sometimes because I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna lean into American stereotypes. I'm just gonna be like the bold sort of person who's like, no, actually you didn't get this right. No, actually you need to fix it in ways that I wouldn't have. I probably in the States I would probably have been like, oh no, it's just fine, everything's fine. No, I ordered a completely other dish, but this is fine. No.
Mm.
So in a weird way, I think that I feel like I have a little more permission to uh to do things perhaps that Brits would find uncouth, you know, because I'm like,
Talking
oh,
about talking about transportation and how in the U.S. We're so dependent upon our cars, and
yeah.
having been to my European experience mostly is in Spain, but it's I'm sure it's similar in the public transport realm. Do you think that sort of do you think that indicates a difference in attitude about what sort of privileges we expect as Americans versus people in other nations, and on a symbolic or larger scale in other
Mm.
ways?
Yeah, I think in a way the scale of life is just smaller in the UK, and that includes transportation in a way, not just geographically, right? So the classic thing is you know um, a Brit will be like, oh, I haven't seen my dad in ages. He lives so far away, and it's like a 45-minute drive, right? Whereas that's like a commute for an American, and not even a particularly long one. So from a geographic scale, their sort of lives are scaled down, I think, a little bit. But it also translates to the size of their cars and the size of the engines that are in their cars. People make do with much smaller cars, and they do a lot with those smaller cars. I have a friend who took over her brother's gardening business, and they have just a little four door tiny little car, and she manages to put like a lawnmower in there, like
Hmm.
her weed whacker. Like she runs her little gardening business like out of the back of this like what would be considered com- very compact hatchback four-door like car, right? Which I don't think many Americans would probably look at that car and think, "Oh, that's a working vehicle that's doing like
Right.
lawn maintenance work." Um,
And I think even worse, there would be some judgment associated with, like, if this person came to do business and you see them in this, you might think that they're less professional almost.
yeah, 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 for sure. And I think, yeah, I think just like like people get paid a little less. People sort of make do with less. There's a big culture of sort of buying used. So even people who have like the money to buy new, like they're still interested in like going to charity shops and sort of being more sort of thrifty. And that's not considered that's considered very normal. Like very middle class people like go to charity shops regularly and like look for items there. And part of the reason I think that they can get away with being paid much less is that their food costs are, I think, like less in some regards. At least in the grocery store, like eating out in the UK is one of the most expensive things you can do. But like buying groceries is pretty inexpensive right now. Although I think there may be some Brexit impacts, but um, and then also like they don't have all of those other medical costs, right? Like that we may incur. So like I went and got a prescription for my mom and it was a $90 copay for this prescription for some eye drops for her. But in the UK, like you just get, based on what your income is, you get a percentage taken out for the National Health Service and that's it. Like when I buy prescriptions, I pay like a flat rate of I think it's like £9 now for each prescription, no matter what it is. So,
Yeah.
so like yeah.
Who'd have thunk it?
So in some ways, I think that like they do live, they are getting paid less. Their like salaries aren't as big, but they also have less expenses, like especially in less like financial risk from a healthcare perspective as well.
Sure.
You
Yeah, and I was just listening. In some European countries, gas is as much as doing the conversion, like $9-10 a gallon
Yeah,
over there. And so I think that it just makes sense that things are more locally centered. That the public transportation having just a more communal aspect, I think probably affects a lot of those sort of maybe cultural shifts that we're talking about. Sorry, that's the coffee maker in the background.
well, I mean, I think it's not. I think it is that. I think that like I think there is a historically there has been a strong move towards providing, subsidized and centralized services to the UK population, like historically. So it's not just that the sort of people sort of think that some of these things are public goods that should be protected and provided for, but also that there was like investment over, the last like several decades to build the train lines to, do that. And there's a big ongoing debate about the trains in the UK because they previously were nationalized, then they got privatized, and now everyone's like, well, maybe we should renationalize them. I think running train systems is just really difficult, and so
For sure.
yeah,
Just like any other infrastructure, it's just
yeah,
it's yeah, for sure. Um, so something that I think about when we start talking about, any sort of political question, and what we're talking about is a comparison also in just as simple as geographical size. So America's really big,
yeah,
and we have this sort of split cultural identity because on one hand we're the United States, we're this massive single country, but uh, equally important to that is each individual state's identity, and so we have these sort of cultural internal conflicts with identity that happen a lot. And I wonder if there's any sort of comparison that goes on in the UK. I know that, again, this is speaking purely from my experience of having visited Spain because of Eva. And there, you do have a strong national identity, but the provinces, each individual province does have a very strong individual cultural identity. And this goes all the way back to like former kingdoms and city states and things like that. So that local identity is very important. Is that true in the UK as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I think like when we're talking about the UK, right, it is the United Kingdom. So there are three devolved states, right? So you have Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and then you have England. And so there's definitely strong identities associated with those countries, right? But then even within those, right, just like in Spain, people have been living there for thousands of years. So there's lots of time for them to develop strong identities around where they live and like that kind of thing. In England, certainly there's a lot of talk about like northern versus southern culture, right? The northerners are more friendly and open, and the southerners less so. Kind of perhaps the opposite in the
The reverse of
U.S.
here. That's exactly what I was just thinking. Yeah.
And then even like across different cities, like they'll have like there'll be their city stereotypes, just like there are like sort of perhaps city and state stereotypes here, that kind of thing. And of course, like I think regional agricultural products are big stereotypes people like to so everyone pokes fun at Wales for having sheep, and like in the west of England they're all farmers, so they're sort of that's sort of where the rednecks are, that kind of thing.
What's the colloquial equivalent of that there? I'm just curious.
Of a redneck? Oh
Yeah.
gosh, I don't know.
Is it is it something you wouldn't say?
Oh no, I don't think there's anything red. I don't know.
That's
Um,
funny. I like
yeah,
terminology.
yeah, because I'm trying to think because we would say like hick redneck,
Right.
but they wouldn't.
They just
Uh,
wouldn't.
yeah,
they're,
yeah.
they're
Out
above.
west, I don't know. Like, so in the West Country, they have like a very strong accent. So I'm just thinking of my friend being like, "Oh, they're all farmers out there," you know. Like,
So you were born in the U.S., but your mom is from England, and your dad's obviously from the United States too.
yep, yeah,
How did that affect you growing up in terms of culture and travel and things like that?
yeah. So weirdly, like, I remember I didn't have a mom. I had a mum, right? So for like until I was probably about like 12, I couldn't say mom. It just didn't feel right to me. So like people would say, "Oh, like how's your mom?" And I'm like, "Oh, my mom's fine." Like, like that because that's what she was called. She signs her cards mom. She's mom, right? And then sort of I think like at some point I switched over to just saying mom. But yeah, but it's really funny. I think that because I studied abroad in the UK when I was 21, like during my university years. And I remember like when I first went, I felt like suddenly the world was working in the way that I thought it would work. And I kind of was surprised by that because I think that because of sort of spending so much time with my mom, I sort of had like a social interaction script that was very English, and I don't think I realized how English it was until I like went to the UK and it was in England, and like I was like, oh, everyone's sort of reacting the same way that I react, like sort of like, oh, I'm so sorry, like very apologetic and bubbly and sort of in that classic sort of English stereotype, and so it felt like oddly very familiar in a way, which I was like, oh, okay, but yeah, otherwise, I think there's a lot of like English influence on American culture, and certainly in certain some regards. So in some ways, like I think there are sort of things that I might think of as being sort of English polite awkwardness, but actually it occurs in different sort of ethnic communities also. Like there's this I feel like the Midwest can have like an awkward, overly polite sort of vibe going to it as well. But yeah, so I think like growing up, like it definitely because it's not just that my mom's English, it's also that my parents are very well traveled, right? And they actually met right when they were both living abroad in what was Yugoslavia, and so they're both people who are interested in travel, and they both have had a lot of experiences. I think like growing up with them, I had sort of a sort of a perspective on sort of things that perhaps other people didn't because they would say things like, "Oh, Americans are so like X," And I think that like if you're someone who either doesn't have sort of a non-American experience in your life or perspective, or has traveled, it's like a little harder to sort of see outside of the sort of, it's like fish don't know they're in the water, right? So
Right,
it's
right.
hard to see the Americanness when it's sort of soaked in so deep. So like I think like some of that is what you get from sort of travel or interacting with people who come from sort of different cultures. And so I think like I was very lucky to have that experience. And then also like, being like a queer person also makes you sort of not normative and sort of a little outside of things, and gives you a little bit of a perspective on what are sort of accepted as how things are, or the sort of the stories we tell about what life is supposed to look like, right?
Sure. And living in for those who don't know, we both grew up in Homestead, South Florida. It's a very multicultural town, predominantly, you know, Latino, Hispanic, things like that. But it does, I think, offer a taste of what living in a living abroad might be like in terms of having to deal with multiple cultures at the same time. Do you think that that's a fair assessment? Do you think you're better prepared for that sort of an experience living in a city like Miami?
Absolutely. I mean, I think like the last time I looked was several years ago. Like Miami-Dade County has like over 50% foreign born. So like we just have the we're very lucky in a way that we have so many different like cultures coming here, and lots of people coming here and from all over. I think everyone thinks about Cubans in Miami, but we have lots of Mexicans, lots of Nicaraguans, like everywhere from Central South America, the Caribbean. We got all those folks coming in. And yeah, I think like my take on what how our high school was set up was, it really felt like it was like a third Latino of various various types, and then you had sort of a third like African American and like a third white. And I think that that's pretty diverse considering we were in a pretty rural area, like sort of suburban rural sort of mix. That's a pretty diverse sort of mix of folks. So yeah, I think we are very lucky to have so many different sort of cultures, and it is very much. I think it is much more the Americas, like Central South America, Caribbean. That's and that's one of the things I've noticed in the UK, right? Like I hear a lot more news about neighboring European countries in the UK, or more news about India because of all the community that live in the UK from India. But I don't hear like the Latin American news that I would hear in Miami, right? Like I feel like Miami, like you hear about what's going on in Brazil, what's going on in Mexico, what's going on in Cuba, and I attribute that just to regionalism, right? Like you're just those are your neighbors, and then also you just have people who are from those countries there, so you sort of have more ties to those folks. But yeah, I think yeah,
And coming just to speak a little bit to current events, obviously Roe versus Wade was just kind of overturned.
yeah,
Um, Not so much your thoughts on that because I suspect that I know what they are,
yeah.
but I am curious about coverage and how those sorts of stories are seen from outside, and not just Roe versus Wade, but gun violence,
Mm.
some of these more topical issues that are huge conflicts culturally here in the United States. What's the international take on those? Do they get covered at all? Is it a point of interest? Are there just like, oh, those silly Americans? I'm curious.
So I think like the UK and certainly the English, I think do there is like a strong sort of cultural connection, I think, with the U.S. Like there's a lot of immigration between the UK and the U.S., and like the Brits love to vacation in the U.S. They love every time I say I'm from Florida, they're like someone's like, "Oh, I've been to Florida," and then I was like, "Oh, you've been to Disney World?" And they're like, "Yeah." And I was like, okay. It's like 99% of the time. It's like, oh yeah, well, I went to Disney World. And I'm like,
And that is Florida. You're right.
yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, so I would say like, they definitely keep up with American politics. So my British friends will talk to me about like what's going on in the States. So I actually found out about Roe v. Wade because one of my like group chats, like someone started like talking about it, and I was like, wait, what's happening? So it's definitely something they are paying attention to, and whether that's because of historical ties or because the US is just one of the big dominant powers in the world, and like sort of those politics get covered in places. But I mean, so for the gun violence stuff, it's one of those things where as an American, like one of the first things like a Brit might tell you or ask you about is like gun violence. Like they, or like, just sort of like rib you about it. Like, oh, well, you Americans, you all have guns, you know, and like, which is a very foreign idea to, like someone in the UK, right? Like there's just not that much gun ownership. Like you would have to be like a police officer, and not all police officers even carry weapons, right? Or you would be like a farmer or something, or you would be someone who was like a hobbyist who like went to a shooting range and you like had shotguns there. But the idea that you just have guns around,
And carry them around with you on the street?
yeah, no, definitely not. But yeah, so I think that like that is one of the things that I think at least a lot of the Brits that I encounter, which obviously I'm probably encountering more middle class, more sort of educated sort of folks, like they're very confused about like why guns are so important and why like so many people have so many guns. So I'm often answering questions about that, and sort of being like, why hasn't action been taken? Like, what's going on?
That's
And
interesting.
yeah, yeah. And then with regard to sort of like the pro-choice, pro-life debate, that's pretty much a settled. That's not a subject of debate in the UK. There's like a small fringe of like sort of right wing sort of folks who obviously want to ban abortion, but they don't get airtime. There are no like major political figures who use that as an issue that they stump, for. It's pretty much like a not it's not a public debate. It's a settled it's a settled issue, and I think it's probably more considered a personal health issue than a political debate.
Which kind
Yeah,
of makes sense, I guess.
yeah, yeah,
Do you, as you're describing having to answer these questions in the very much the same way that you're answering questions for me,
yeah.
do you find that when people in the UK are asking you these questions, do you feel yourself getting defensive, or do you sometimes try to shape things in a way that makes America look less weird, less crazy? I'm just curious how that feels, because like I remember being in Spain having to explain some things to people. It's like, geez, I don't know, we're Americans. What do you expect? I mean, it's like
Exactly.
you just don't get it. But do you find yourself kind of in that position of trying to shape a message in a particular way?
Yeah, I think for the most part, like, so I think that I probably had like what was a very typical, like, overeducated, like lefty, like position on America, which was like I looked to Europe and I thought, oh, they're doing so much more, like they're so much more sophisticated, or like, and I think that like that sort of vibe exists, right? Like in some circles in the US. And so when I was in the US, I definitely like, and I still do, like, will complain about and trash talk the US to some degree. But it has changed now that I like live in the UK, because it's a little bit like, I can make fun of my brother, but if you make fun of my brother, we have a problem.
Right.
And so yeah, and so I tend to sort of, it kind of depends on what the vibe is of the person who is coming at me, because sometimes the vibe is, oh, Americans are all uncultured. They don't know anything about Europe. You're all like gun toting, crazy, like religious extremists. And like, if they're coming at me with that sort of unnuanced sort of vibe, then I usually push back pretty hard. And I've sort of moved on from now, especially now that I've lived in the UK for so long, like I've definitely moved on from the idea that like, oh, like that the UK doesn't also suffer from all of the same problems that the US has with regard to like pushes to privatize like public things, like that there are whole swaths of, what what would be considered sort of like less educated sort of folks, right, who also don't have a lot of regional knowledge, right? Like, so for me, I usually try and push back and be like, don't try to hold America to a different standard than like your own country. Like, there's high culture in the US and there's low culture in the UK. But like sometimes like, and even like well-educated Brits who you would think would have like a slightly more nuanced sort of take on things will be like, oh, America has no culture. It's all just like hamburgers and then sort of stuff. And I'm like, no, that's definitely not the case. Like, there's huge art movements that have originated in the US. Like, there's plenty of high culture that's produced in the US. You're just being snobbish, right? But there are like, as you sounds like you maybe heard like had in Spain, like there are people who are just genuinely like, I'm confused, like I am trying to understand how this happened, and those people I'm like much more happy to engage with, and sort of be
Yeah,
like,
and
yeah,
again, I think sometimes that confusion again just comes down to honestly just a sense of scale. It's just America's really big.
it
It's
is.
really, really big. And like I remember somebody asked, "Oh, where did you grow up?" And we're like, "Oh, we grew up in Miami." And oh, they're like, "That's the capital of the United States, right?" And we're like, "Ah," because their framework in Spain, they get most of their coverage in the U.S. is dealing with South Florida because that's where the that and New York City, those are the big places where they hear about because of the concentrations of Spanish speaking people. So there's the sense of geography is kind of mixed.
Yeah.
Um, what are you doing these days as far as work? Have you decided? I mean, for the middle to long term future, UK is going to be your home base.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I went over there, thinking, oh, I'll just stay for a couple years. I'll like use this as a place to like travel from, because as I said, like my parents sort of met abroad, so like there's a little bit of a family tradition of living abroad. So I was like, oh, I'll just go do that for a couple of years and come back. But I the UK is not perfect. There's lots of frustrations to be had with it. But and this is gonna sound crazy, but like I just don't want to deal with the American healthcare system. Like, when I think about moving back, yes, I could get paid more. But the idea that I essentially have to become my own healthcare administrative expert in order to just access healthcare is a huge deterrent to me. It takes so much time and effort, and like it's so much money. and again, like the UK system isn't perfect. There are issues with like like wait lists and those kind of things for some things, and they're very good with reactive sort of stuff, right? If you break your leg, you will get immediate, amazing attention. But if, for example, like I have pursued asking to be assessed for ADHD, it's going to take 2 years for me to get to get that right. So like there are problems, but I don't. I never have to think about it. It comes out of my paycheck. If I have an emergency, I call and it's taken care of. Like, for example, at the time I didn't know this. I had a third-degree burn and it got infected, and I called the helpline and I was just like, "Hi, I think this thing might be infected," and they were like, "Okay, can you get to this urgent care in 1 hour?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And I went, and then for the next like 3 weeks, I went in twice a week to my local surgery office to have my bandages like taken off, looked at, examined, all of that, just like for 3, 4 weeks, just constantly in and out of like, care. And that was, I had already paid for it. It was from my taxes. I didn't have to present an ID card. I didn't have to do anything. I just said, hi, I'm here for my appointment. Went in and I left. Like,
Wow.
it's nice. I didn't have to go like see if someone was in network, you know,
Right.
and I know that that's crazy because like luckily I haven't had major medical issues that I've had to deal with like regularly, which is very nice. That's what we all want. But like even just the idea that I might have to interact with the healthcare system in the US like 2 or 3 times a year, I'm like, I really don't want to.
Yeah, it's really it's frustrating because as we're dealing with my dad right now, he just had surgery and he's actually staying with us right now. He's staying with us because he's a veteran and he gets all of his healthcare covered through the VA. but the hospital social worker post surgery requested that he get post surgical physical therapy and full time care. I mean, he's 76 years old, and they said no. He's able to walk and move his arms after having open heart surgery. Therefore, full time in care treatment is not what he needs. He's good to go home, and we'll send like a home healthcare person once a week. And it's like, no. And we pursued it further. What are the options for getting full time coverage? And then that's when it's like, oh, you're gonna have to pay out of pocket, and here's your hundreds of thousands of dollars of potential bills just for a few weeks of treatment. It's like, it does not make sense. And I think, not to get too big of a on a soapbox, but like that's the modern segregation is almost purely economic, and it's really tragic.
Yeah, absolutely. And you still get those class dynamics like within like a nationalized health service, right? Because I think some
Hmm.
people think that when you have a nationalized health service, like that's the only healthcare access you have access to. But you can pay for private care. You can pay hundreds of pounds if you want and do it all via private if you want, right? Skip all those. I could pay 500 pounds and get assessed for ADHD if I want. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think that the idea, and I think that we use in the U.S. I'm not sure what the terminology there is, but the idea of the social safety net, like
Hmm.
it sounds great, but obviously here it's used in a very pejorative way. But I think that not having to worry about it, just knowing that it's there, God, I wish we had that. I have health insurance, sure, through my job, but it doesn't matter. I still have to pay money out of pocket every
Yeah,
single time I use it.
yeah.
So yeah, that's for sure, and I find it interesting that that's almost, it sounds like the issue for you is that healthcare, that guarantee.
Yeah, it's weird. It very much is. And the other thing that like sort of is wild to me, like just listening to the story you were telling about your dad, was just that there could be a healthcare professional make a recommendation that then a not healthcare professional denies the claim of. And for me, that is one of the most insane parts of like the American medical system is that you have these private companies whose responsibility is only to their profits, like making making medical decisions. And it's like, and people who are worried about universal health care be like, oh well, we don't want like government death panels or whatever. And I'm like, at least I elect the government. Like at least they are responsible to me, you know. So yeah, for me, so I think it's the medical stuff, but then the other thing is this sort of attitude towards work-life balance is the other major thing that Americans are they're they work really hard. Obviously, there are a lot of other countries where that have much different and worse working conditions than Americans, like depending on what sector you're working in. But Americans still work really hard. They work really long hours, and there is sort of an expectation that you might just be on demand. Especially, I think, especially for like sort of white collar work, in a sort of blue collar jobs like are very physically demanding, and like if you're working a factory line, that's an incredibly demanding job, right? But like that, the demands I think in white collar work are slightly different, and it's sort of invades your personal time. It's answering emails on the weekend or after hours or things like that, and the expectation that you will do that. And I think that there is some of that in the UK. I think the other thing that has to be said is I work in the academic world, and so in academia, like I work in a university library. So the folks who work as lawyers in the UK or finance guys in the UK, they are working under pretty intense, like sort of probably lack of work life balance. But I like work in a sector that doesn't have that kind of pressure. But yeah, like your vacation time is your vacation time. You're not expected to answer emails. Like I had an old boss, like when I first arrived. I answered an email on like a Sunday, and I got a talking to on Monday. my boss, my boss is like, "What are you doing? Why are you answering emails on a Sunday?"
Yes, it'll be there when you get back, I promise.
Exactly, exactly. And so like the amount of leave, so I get 27 or 28 days leave a year. So I essentially get like a month's worth of time off. And that's not including I think we have 8 public holidays as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to Spain. Again, I'm comparing apples to oranges, but there's at least a similar enough flair that everything shuts down for 2 hours in the middle of the day, and it drove me crazy at first because it's like I need to get this thing right now. That whole idea of convenience was it for the first week or two. It just drove me absolutely nuts that at 12 o'clock every day, the whole country basically just shuts down and everybody goes home, and I didn't get it. It drove me crazy. But man, when I got back, that first time I went, we stayed for a month, and so essentially we lived in a different country. It wasn't just like, oh, we're gonna stay in a hotel. We lived in somebody's house. But when we got back, man, that time, just the way that you do it, it's it's healthier. You're not expected to be here or there. This is your time. We give this time to you because it actually improves productivity while you're on the job because, yeah, it just makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So like in obviously in London, big city, it's different. But shops close like by so like the latest like a TJ Maxx to be open would be like 7 p.m. You know what I mean? And grocery stores on Sunday are closed unless they're like under a certain square footage. So like very small ones can stay open, but otherwise they're closed at 4 p.m. So like at first I was like you, very frustrated about not being able to like get what I wanted immediately because like stuff stays open until like what, like 9 p.m. in the US sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then yeah, but then I was like, this is great. Like people get to go home and spend time with their families in the evening. Like they have like almost like most people get like Sunday afternoons off. Like this is great. This is like a more humane approach. Like I can wait. I don't need that like piece of plastic that I was gonna buy or whatever it was.
As you think of your own identity now, like how do you think of yourself as a citizen of the world? Do you envision yourself as a blend of different things, or do you identify more with one or the other, or how do you feel about that?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I always felt sort of like English and American because my mom is English. So, I feel it's that classic thing where I feel more English in the US and more American in the UK, right? Um, and so, uh, it, in a weird way, like in the UK, like I really embrace and I can see the ways in which I'm very American. Like I'm very, I'm very sort of energetic. Like I feel like we're Labradors. We're like friendly and we're like upbeat and we're sort of a little bit louder than others, right? And like I can see myself being that in a space of not Labradors. Like I'm a Labrador among cats, right? And the cats are like, oh, this is really cute, this Labrador, but sometimes it's a bit much, you know. Um, and then which I'm fine. I embraced a bit much. And then because also it gives me, like I said, at the beginning, it sort of gives me like permission to do things that are a little bit transgressive, which I don't mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but then like coming back to the US, I do feel sometimes a little bit more English, in part because of some of these things that we've been talking about, like attitudes towards work, attitudes towards like what the role of government is in life and what sort of should be considered services that are just provided to people, and like some of those services that we have in the UK that like don't exist here. And so, and certainly like, you know, in England, they've had many more terrorist attacks than the US has had. I mean, not on the same scale, right? Obviously, like 9/11 was that's a big scale of terrorist attack. Um, but I very rarely feel unsafe when I'm walking around London, you know. But I do sometimes, like when I come back to the U.S., I do have fleeting thoughts about gun violence. I'm like, oh, I'm in a movie theater. there was a mass shooting in the movie theater, you know,
Yeah.
like
You know somebody in that room is caring.
yeah, yeah, and that freaks me out a little bit. It does. So that's when I feel like sort of slightly out of step, a little bit out of my element um, when I'm in the U.S. But I wouldn't say I don't think I would think of myself as a citizen of the world because I feel like I'm more like a citizen of just these two countries. but I
Gotcha.
but I do think going back to kind of what we were talking about at the very beginning, like I do think though I've really appreciated being able to meet. I'm essentially in a different multicultural mix. So I grew up in like a very Latino sort of focused, Caribbean focused mix of folks. And now in the UK, because of all the colonialism and that kind of stuff, I am getting to interact with like sort of people who are either from or are the children of people who are from places in Africa. Like Africa feels so far away. Like I'm not at all oriented towards like Africa and like what's going on there. But England is much closer to Africa, and like a lot of our produce comes from Africa. So I'm just like sort of encountering sort of various different cultures from Africa and sort of thinking about it in ways that I think like similarly the Brits don't think about Central America in the same way because they're just not as close. They don't have as many people from there. So like being able to meet like all those sort of folks, all those sort of South Asian folks who were there, all the East Asian folks, like the Brits had they managed to get all over the place. So there are people from all over the world there. So it's that I really appreciate too. Is sort of getting to experience sort of a different slice of multiculturalism in the UK.
And last question, and I hope you don't take offense to it, but the the opportunities that you had having parents from two countries and the privilege of being able to travel as you have, do you think that, I mean, travel in America is a very limited thing. It's very regional and it's very rarely international for most people.
Yeah,
Do you think that if more people had the opportunity to travel abroad in the U.S., that would be, I mean, and that might be an obvious question, but do you think that would perhaps alleviate some of these internal cultural tensions that we experience?
yeah, it's an interesting question. I think I'm not sure. I think that I think obviously like as someone who has traveled a lot, like and comes from a family who travels, I think there's like a lot of good value in it. And I think it does exactly what, you know, we've been talking about, which is, you get the chance to experience like a completely different perspective on life, right? Just like literally how people live their lives. You get to see that, like, oh, all of the things that I think of as being completely normal and the standard way things are done, actually, like, other people have completely other ways of doing things in their life, expectations around life, society, the role of government, like the role of family, all those things, right? And so I think, like, from that perspective, it it adds, it can like help people understand their own lives and their own like culture in a lot of ways. And certainly I think if you had, like, if I met some like super conservative Texan in the middle of like Hamburg, Germany, we're going to have things to talk about because we're both Americans, and like we're going to be able to talk about like how, like, it will be easier for us to identify the ways in which we have more in common than like some of the ways that we are different, right? Because we are like these two sort of fish out of water. So I think in a more basic way, in a way that like traveling forces you to think about yourself and society and culture in a more reflective way, I think it could be useful. But I'm not sure. Like, but that's a very different sort of experience than sort of you can understand a different way of life without necessarily changing your own ideas about what you think is right and what you think is appropriate. Because I certainly will sometimes in the UK be like, you guys do this wrong. There's no nuance there. I'm just like, no, no, you do this wrong. And I
Mm.
know that I'm saying that purely because I just grew up doing things a different way. And it's a joke, like I'm mostly joking, right?
Right.
And similarly, they'll be like, no, Alice, you're absolutely wrong. Like they'll be like, you're absolutely mental. That is not the way to do things. You know what I mean? So I think like, to more succinctly answer your question, I think travel does a heap of good for most people, like just in general. I'm not convinced that it would necessarily solve internal political issues, but I don't know. I would love it if everyone could have the opportunity to do it if they wanted to. Because, yeah, like you said, the US is on such a bigger scale and there is a lot of travel like between states. And this is actually one of the things that I say to like the Brits or Europeans who say, "Oh, Americans, they like don't even know where Brussels is." Right, or whatever, they don't, they can't identify like, European countries on a map or something like that. And I'm like, it's regional neighbors. Like Americans, like the U.S. is about the size of Europe. Americans can quite easily. I can tell you like what like the major crop is in Idaho. Right, it's potatoes. Right, like we have a lot of knowledge that is on an equivalent regional space, but it's just the
It's like it's
U.S.
like it's like going to somebody in London saying, "Okay, without looking at the names, point to Akron, Ohio." Nobody's going to know where that is.
Exactly. So like, so I push back when folks sort of are like, oh, Americans don't know geography, and I'm like, Americans know a lot of geography, and it's relevant to their lives, which is regional geography. It just happens to be in the same country as them, but you're covering the same period in the same way that like those Brits would be lost if they were trying to point out states in the U.S. or even countries in South America. You know.
All right, Alice, thank you so much for sitting with me, and I know you've got places to be, so enjoy your day, be safe. I'm
Thanks.
glad you're feeling well.
Well, thanks so much, man. It's been a pleasure.